People said Mrs. Brantley's sitting room was the most beautiful in Charleston. Soft drapes, bought porcelain, a big string instrument no one played. But what made the room famous wasn't the furniture. It was what sat at her feet. A little girl in lace, too tiny for the chair, too quiet for her age. The mistress fed her sweetness from a silver spoon and called her darling pet. And when guests asked who she was, Mrs. Brantley smiled and said, "Oh, just something sweet I found at a sale. Before we begin, make sure you sign up to the Macabre Record and tell me in the comments where are you listening from tonight. Now let's go back to Charleston, 1839, to the house where beauty was loved and humanity was furniture. They called her Minnie because it was simpler than saying what she was. She had been born small enough that when the traders lifted her from the wagon, the crowd laughed instead of offering money. Someone said she looked like a doll. Another said she looked like a fault. Mrs. Brantley bought her for the price of a dog. The mistress said she wanted something fine to lighten the room, and that was what Minnie became, a living decoration. She was dressed in lace and soft shoes placed near the piano or the window, wherever the people would notice her best. When visitors came, Mrs. Brantley would say, "Isn't she dear?" and feed her sugared almonds from a porcelain bowl, one by one, as though she were feeding a pet. Minnie would open her hand and take them, small and well-behaved, careful not to let her face show the taste of salt. The sitting room smelled of roses and starch and wine. No one noticed that she never ate at the table, that she slept beside the fireplace in a basket lined with old quilts, or that her back hurt from sitting too straight too long. Mrs. Brantley's husband, Edward, rarely entered the room. When he did, he looked at Minnie as though she was something the house itself had coughed up, but he never said a word. The mistress ran the house like a clock wound too tight, every breath measured, every movement practiced. At night, when the guests were gone, the laughter fading down the cobblestone street, Minnie would hear the mistress walking back and forth. Sometimes the sound came close, the click of heels, the soft hiss of silk skirts, then a whisper, "Stand straight, always straight." Pretty things mustn't look tired. The houseworkers watched but said nothing. Sarah the cook slipped her scraps of bread when she could. Samuel, the boy who cleaned the lamps, once told her, "Don't let her make you forget how to walk." But it was easy to forget. Days folded into weeks. The world beyond the sitting room grew small, like a dream she could no longer fit inside. Once, when the mistress hosted a garden party, Minnie was placed outside for the first time. She stood near a fountain dressed in blue silk, the sun sharp on her skin. The guests smiled, cooed, circled her like she was art. One man asked if she could sing. Mrs. Brantley smiled and said she doesn't need to. Her silence is her charm, and Minnie, small and still, felt the words settle over her like dust, soft, choking, impossible to shake off. The kitchen sat behind the main house, low ceiling, warm and full of smells that didn't belong to the world upstairs. Minnie liked it there, even though she was not supposed to. The mistress said the smoke made her less presentable, so she went only when she could slip away unnoticed. Sarah the cook was the first person who ever spoke to her like she was a person. A wide woman with kind eyes and a tired back, Sarah would hum while stirring pots that never stopped boiling. "You hungry, baby?" she'd ask, not looking up. And Minnie would nod, though she never said a word. The first time Sarah gave her a biscuit still hot, edges crisp. Minnie ate it fast, crumbs catching on her dress. Sarah laughed softly. "Slow down, sugar. Ain't no one taking it from you." It became their secret. A stolen piece of bread here, a bit of jam there. The other workers noticed, but never told. In a house like the Brantleys, quietness wasn't just habit, it was survival. At night, when the laughter and piano music floated down from the sitting room, Sarah would tell stories over the fire, tales from before, from other places, about rivers and skies so wide they had no walls. Many would listen, small and cross-legged by the door, trying to picture what a place like that felt like. A place where you weren't part of someone's furniture. Once she asked, "Sarah, why she keep me there in that room?" Sarah stopped, her hand stilling over the pot. Because people like her need something smaller than themselves to feel big. Minnie thought about that all night. The next morning, the mistress noticed dirt on her dress hem. "You've been crawling again," she said. "A lady doesn't crawl." She knelt down, voice syrup sweet but eyes hard. "You want to be a lady, don't you, Minnie?" Minnie didn't answer. Mrs. Brantley smiled, the kind of smile that only sharpens cruelty. "Then you'll sit in the sitting room until you learn how." By evening, Minnie's legs had gone numb. Her stomach growled. She stared at the door, waiting for footsteps that never came. When Edward Brantley came home from town, he stopped in the doorway and frowned. "For God's sake, Ellen, she's a child, not a small statue." "She's mine," the mistress said. "She stays where I put her." He looked at his wife for a long moment, then at Minnie. "Everything in this house is yours, isn't it?" And for a second, just a flicker, the mistress's eyes shifted, not with guilt, but with something closer to fear. That night, Minnie didn't go to the kitchen, but when she lay awake, she could still smell the biscuits, hear Sarah's humming, and feel something begin to stir. Not rebellion yet, but recognition. The first seed of a truth she'd soon come to understand. There are cages you can't see until you stop calling them home. Edward Brantley began to notice her after that night, not as his wife's plaything, but as something else. At first, it was guilt that drew his eyes. He'd see Minnie sitting in that stiff chair, her hands folded, eyes lowered, as if she were trying to disappear inside herself. There was no movement in her except her breath, small and shallow. He started leaving the sitting room door open when he passed by, pretending it was by mistake. Sometimes he'd find an excuse to linger, to adjust the curtains, to pour another drink, to drop a coin he never picked up. Minnie would look up only once, briefly, then go still again. She didn't trust him, not yet. She knew the house was a stage, and everyone inside it a role they hadn't chosen. One evening, when Mrs. Brantley was hosting her women's circle upstairs, Edward found Minnie by the window. Rain streaked the glass, blurring the gardens outside. He stopped in the doorway and said softly, "Do you ever go out there?" She didn't answer. He tried again. "You should. It's only flowers." Minnie's voice, when it came, surprised them both. "Flowers die in vases, sir." Edward froze. He hadn't heard her speak before, not in words meant for anyone but the mistress. Her voice was small, but there was something in it that felt unafraid. He set his drink down. "Who told you that?" "No one. I just watched." The words hung in the room like the echo of a truth too delicate to touch. Edward nodded once, then turned away. "Keep watching, Minnie," he said quietly. "It's the only way to stay sane in this house." After that, he spoke to her more often. Never long, never enough for the workers to notice. Once he gave her a small book, its cover worn, the pages soft with age. "It's poetry," he said. "You can keep it if you like." Minnie traced the letters on the cover that she couldn't yet read. "The mistress won't like it." "Then don't tell her," he said. "Not everything belongs to her." For the first time, she smiled. But secrets in a house like that had a way of being overheard. A week later, Mrs. Brantley found the book under Minnie's cushion. She turned it over in her hands, frowning. "Where did this come from?" Minnie hesitated. "It was given." "By whom?" Minnie said nothing. Mrs. Brantley's voice sharpened. "Do you think you can keep things from me?" When she struck her, it wasn't hard. A gloved slap, quick and practiced, but it landed with the weight of years. That night Minnie didn't cry. She sat by the fire with the book hidden beneath her quilt, the sting on her cheek fading, replaced by something new. Not anger, not even pain. Something colder, something like knowing. For the next few days, the mistress's voice carried through every corner of the house like the creak of old wood before it breaks. The workers walked lighter, their eyes low. Even the birds outside seemed to avoid the Brantley porch. Mrs. Brantley no longer fed Minnie from her hand. She didn't speak to her either. Instead, she would walk through the sitting room and move things, vases, pillows, candles, just to see if Minnie would flinch when the silence broke. She always did. It became a game for the mistress, played with the kind of grace that made cruelty look like good manners. If Minnie dropped a spoon, she'd say, "A proper lady keeps her balance." If her hands trembled, delicate things should be steady. And if Minnie dared to look away, even for a second, she'd murmur, "I see everything in this room. Everything that's mine," Sarah once told her. "Don't let her get inside your head, baby." But it was already too late. Mrs. Brantley lived there now, in her thoughts, her steps, her posture. One afternoon, Edward came home early. He found his wife sitting with her friends, tea steaming between them. Minnie sat on the floor beside her chair, still. One of the ladies asked, "Is that the little thing you told us about?" Mrs. Brantley smiled. "My sitting-room pet. She keeps me company when Edward's away." The room giggled with laughter, small, rehearsed, like wind chimes in a storm. Edward's jaw tightened. "She's not a pet," he said. The women fell quiet. The mistress's hand froze over her teacup. "You sound as though you care," she said lightly, though her eyes had already darkened. He didn't answer. He left the room without another word, but the silence he left behind was heavier than any argument. That evening, Mrs. Brantley visited the sitting room alone. Minnie sat by the window, the poetry book hidden in her lap. The mistress closed the door quietly and stood behind her. "Do you know why my husband looks at you?" she asked. Minnie didn't move. "No, ma'am, because you remind him of what he wants and can't have." Something small, something that obeys. Minnie's throat went dry. "I don't think he don't think." The mistress cut in. "Pretty things don't think, they reflect." She reached out and touched Minnie's hair. Her fingers moved slow, almost gentle, before tightening in a sharp pull. "You belong here, do you understand?" Minnie nodded. The mistress released her and walked away, whispering as she left, "Good, stay in the light where I can see you." When the door closed, Minnie stayed still for a long time. The candlelight shimmered on the piano, the only thing in the room that didn't seem afraid. Then she opened the poetry book and traced the words again, her small finger following each letter like a prayer. She didn't know how to read yet, but she was learning to remember, and memory in a house like this was the first act of defiance. Rain came to Charleston the next morning, soft and constant, soaking the cobblestones until they gleamed like glass. The Brantley house felt heavier when it rained, as though the walls themselves absorbed the damp, and sighed. Edward spent most of the day in his study. The worker said he'd been drinking again. He didn't speak to his wife at breakfast, nor at dinner. When he did look at her, it was the way a man looks at a painting he no longer recognizes. Minnie saw it. She saw everything. Mrs. Brantley, on the other hand, acted untouched. She hummed through her chores, gave orders with more sugar than usual, and smiled too wide when she passed the sitting-room door. Her calm was a kind of punishment, a silence designed to keep everyone guessing when the storm would finally break. That night, Minnie crept to the kitchen for a bit of bread. Sarah was still awake, elbows on the table, hands clasped. She looked up and said softly, "You should be asleep, baby." "I couldn't," Minnie whispered. Sarah sighed and tore a piece from the loaf, pressing it into her hand. "Don't let her see you sneak in. She'll have my skin if she knows you eat down here." Minnie nodded. "I'll be careful." Sarah studied her a moment longer. "You being quiet lately, even for you. You holding too much in that little head of yours." Minnie hesitated. "If I talk, she'll know." Sarah shook her head. "She already knows everything. That's her sickness. People like her don't got nothing left to love but control." Minnie looked at the bread in her hand. "Do you think she was ever small?" Sarah blinked. "What you mean?" "Like me?" Minnie said before she learned to make people afraid. Sarah's eyes softened. Maybe once, but she didn't stay that way long enough. When Minnie returned to the sitting room, Edward was there, sitting in his chair, staring at the fire. He didn't notice her at first. The orange light flickered across his face, making him look older than he was. "You shouldn't be awake," he said quietly. "I couldn't sleep." He poured himself another drink, the glass shaking in his hand. "Neither can I." She stood near the piano, unsure if she should leave. The sound of rain filled the space between them. After a while he said, "Do you hate her?" Minnie didn't answer. He nodded slowly. "You should." "I think I do." She looked at him then, not as a child looks at a man, but as one prisoner looks at another. "Then why don't you stop her?" The words startled them both. Edward's lips parted, but no sound came. He just stared at the fire as if the flames might explain him. Because he said finally, "The house listens, and I'm too much a coward to hear what it might say back." Minnie watched him for a long moment, then turned toward the door. Behind her he whispered, "Keep the book close." And when she glanced back, she saw something flicker across his face. Not kindness, not guilt, but the faintest trace of apology. Outside, thunder rolled far off, low and tired. Inside, the sitting room glowed like a cage made of firelight, and Minnie understood something she'd never known before. Sometimes the quietest people aren't afraid to speak. They're just waiting for the right silence to break. By the end of the week, Mrs. Brantley had begun to watch Minnie the way a cat watches something that twitches but won't run. Her eyes followed her through the sitting room, over her shoulders, across her hands, as if searching for a secret she couldn't name. The household had grown tense. Sarah moved slower in the kitchen, careful not to draw attention. Samuel avoided the sitting room altogether. Even Edward, who once tried to break the silence, now spent his days behind the study door, the smell of whiskey clinging to the air long after he left it. Only Minnie remained in the light. Always in the light, Mrs. Brantley insisted on it. "Sit where the sun reaches you," she'd say in the morning. "I like to see you shine." Minnie obeyed. She sat near the lace-draped windows, her small hands folded neatly on her lap. But she didn't look at the mistress anymore. Not when she entered the room, not when she spoke, not even when she brushed past close enough for her scent to sting the nose. The first time Minnie didn't look up, Mrs. Brantley stopped mid-step. "Did you hear me?" "Yes, Mom." "Then look at me when you answer." Minnie raised her eyes just barely, enough to be polite, not enough to give in. The silence that followed stretched like pulled thread. Then the mistress smiled. "Good girl," she said, voice brittle. "Pretty things should never forget who looks at them." But she did not move for a long time. She stood there staring, her smile shaking around the edges. That night, the mistress ordered the workers to bring Minnie's quilt and basket bed upstairs. "She'll sleep in the sitting room again," she said. "I don't like her wandering." Sarah's jaw clenched. "Yes, ma'am." When Minnie returned later, the fire was already lit. The air was too warm, heavy with roses and something sour beneath. Mrs. Brantley sat in her chair, still dressed from supper, her hair pinned high and her face powdered pale. "You've grown quiet," she said. "I don't hear your little hum any more." "I wasn't aware I hummed. You did." It was sweet, innocent. The mistress tilted her head, studying her. "You've been speaking to my husband." Minnie froze. "No, Mum." Mrs. Brantley rose from her chair and walked around her in slow, planned circles. The air seemed to bend around the rustle of her dress. "Don't lie to me, child. I can smell deceit the way dogs smell fear. I'm not lying." "Then why does he look at you like you matter?" Minnie swallowed hard. "Maybe because he knows I don't." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Mrs. Brantley struck her, not out of rage this time, but control, precise as a clock. "Don't ever speak to me that way again," she said softly. "You'll forget how to talk before I let you forget your place." When the mistress left, Minnie sat in the dim light, her cheek throbbing. She did not cry. She only looked toward the window where the rain had begun again. For the first time, she wished it would flood so the water could reach the sitting room and wash the light away. For 3 days after the slap, Mrs. Brantley didn't speak to Minnie at all. She would enter the sitting room, glide past her, adjust a curtain, pour her tea, and leave again without a word. The silence was not forgiveness. It was a blade turned flat, waiting for the right angle to cut. Minnie sat by the fire as always. Her cheek had turned faintly yellow where the bruise was healing. Every time she blinked, she could still see the shape of the mistress's ring, small and round, like a mark that didn't burn. Sarah began to visit her more often under the excuse of dusting. She'd pause beside the chair, pretending to fix a vase or tidy the mantel, and whisper things that were dangerous to say out loud. "She's losing her hold, baby. You keep your head low. She don't like what she can't control. That's her kind of sickness." And once, very quietly, "You ain't hers, no matter what she say." Those words sat with Minnie longer than any slap ever had. That night, as she pretended to sleep in her basket by the fireplace, she heard the mistress and Edward arguing upstairs. Their voices were muffled through the walls, but the tones carried, sharp, cold, breaking. "You shame yourself," Mrs. Brantley hissed, whispering to her like she's a child. Edward's voice, rough with drink. "You treat her like an ornament. She is an ornament. That's all she was ever meant to be." There was a crash, glass or porcelain, something fine shattering against the wall, then silence. Minnie pulled the quilt tighter around herself. Somewhere deep in her chest, something began to twist. A feeling that wasn't fear. Not anymore. Something else. By morning, the house was cold again. The mistress came down for breakfast with her hair perfectly clean, her hands steady, her face like polished stone. Edward didn't appear. When Mrs. Brantley passed the sitting room later that day, she stopped. Minnie was still in her chair, the poetry book open on her lap, her finger tracing letters across the page. "What are you doing?" "Learning," Minnie said softly. Mrs. Brantley blinked. "Learning what?" "How to read." The mistress stared for a moment that stretched too long. "Who taught you?" Minnie's voice didn't waver. "No one." Just watching Mrs. Brantley's lips parted, but no sound came. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her cup, then without another word she turned and left. That evening, Sarah found the girl in the kitchen again. "You shouldn't have said that," she whispered, glancing toward the door. "She don't take kindly to clever." "I'm not clever," Minnie said, just tired of being small. Sarah gave her a long look, something between pride and worry. That's how every fight starts, and for the first time, Minnie allowed herself to imagine it. What it might feel like if the sitting room didn't own her anymore. Not freedom, not yet. But the thought of it, and that was the first crack in the walls, and cracks in houses like this don't stay small for long. Charleston's air was thick with heat and gossip the night Mrs. Brantley decided to host her spring party. The invitations had been sent weeks before, back when her social standing was still a subject of admiration and envy. But now the house buzzed with a quieter energy, the kind born of strain, not celebration. The workers worked without speaking. Silver was polished until it caught the candlelight like fire. The carpets were beaten. The piano tuned. Every sound in the house felt like a warning. Minnie was dressed early. The mistress chose her gown herself, pale cream lace with a blue ribbon that bit into her shoulders. "You'll sit by the window tonight," she said, fastening the bow with slow, planned care. "Our guests enjoy seeing you there. You make the room charming." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Brantley's eyes lingered on her. "And you'll be silent. Smiles, not words. You remember how to behave?" "Yes, Mom." When the first guests arrived, the sitting room filled with perfume and laughter. Women in silk found themselves near the doorway. Men spoke too loudly about crops and trade and politics. Mrs. Brantley moved through them like a swan, all grace and gleam, her voice smooth enough to hide the crack beneath. Minnie sat by the window just as she'd been told. The world outside looked blurred, washed in the reflection of candlelight and motion. She felt like she was watching life through glass, trapped between what was real and what was performed. Across the room, Edward stood by the piano, his glass half empty, his eyes far away. Every so often he would look toward Minnie, not in pity, not even in guilt. Something quieter, recognition perhaps, of how small dignity can look when it's trying to survive. Mrs. Brantley noticed. Of course she did. She always noticed. Near the end of the evening, one of the guests, a man from Savannah with a smile that dripped arrogance, nodded toward Minnie and said, "I've never seen one so perfect." "Does she talk?" Mrs. Brantley's fan paused mid-air, not unless spoken to. The man chuckled. Good training. A ripple of polite laughter followed, shallow and cruel. Edward's hand tightened around his glass until the rim cracked. Minnie looked up then, not at the man, but at the mistress. Their eyes met across the room. The world seemed to narrow until it was just the two of them caught in that gaze. The woman who owned her and the child she couldn't quite erase. Then Minnie did something she had never done before. She stood. The conversation stopped. The music stuttered. Every face turned. Minnie's voice was small, steady. "Would you like me to sing, ma'am?" The room went still. Mrs. Brantley's lips parted, a dozen thoughts flickering behind her eyes. "No," she said finally. "I think you've been seen enough for one night." But the damage was done. The silence that followed wasn't polite anymore. It was uneasy, the kind that grows teeth. Minnie sat again, calm, her hands folded once more in her lap. But inside she felt something like air after a storm, raw, sharp, and alive. And upstairs, where the cracks in the ceiling met like veins, the house itself seemed to listen. The night after the party, the Brantley house went still. The laughter that had filled the sitting room seemed to hang in the curtains, faint and stale, as if even it had realized it wasn't welcome anymore. Guests left whispering, not about the food or the music, but about the girl, the small one by the window, the one who stood. By morning, Charleston was already repeating the story, how Mrs. Brantley's little pet had spoken in front of company, how she'd risen like a child who forgot her training, how Edward Brantley hadn't moved to stop her. Rumors in Charleston were like humidity, invisible but impossible to escape. Inside the house, Mrs. Brantley moved with perfect calm. She didn't shout. She didn't slap. She didn't even look at Minnie. She simply began to erase her. The sitting room chair was gone by noon, the lace dress by evening. Minnie was ordered to stay in the workers' quarters, away from the guests, away from sight. "She needs time to remember what she is," the mistress told Sarah. Minnie didn't argue. She just nodded and went where she was told. But that night, when Sarah brought her supper, she found the girl sitting at the small table by the window, staring out into the dark yard. "She's scared," Sarah whispered. "Not of you, of what people might say." Minnie turned to her. "They were already saying it. I just made them hear it louder." Sarah smiled faintly. "You got her rattled, that's for sure. Never seen her so quiet." Never seen him so drunk. Is he angry? Edward? Sarah shrugged. At himself, maybe. But men like him don't fight. They just fade. The next afternoon, Mrs. Brantley sent for Edward. They shut the door to the study, but their voices leaked through the walls. Minnie could hear her tone, smooth, brittle, too calm to be anything but dangerous. "You've made me look bad," the mistress said. "You've made a fool of this house. You did that yourself," Edward answered. A pause, then the sound of something breaking. A decanter, maybe. "You think that little thing matters?" she spat. "She's nothing." "Then why does she frighten you?" No answer, just the slow, shaky exhale of a woman who just realized something she didn't want to know. That night, Mrs. Brantley came to the workers' quarters with a lantern. She didn't speak to Minnie. She didn't need to. She stood in the doorway, her shadow spilling long across the floor. Then she said softly, "I want the book." Minnie held it close to her chest. "It's not yours." The mistress smiled, but her eyes were hollow. "Everything in this house is mine." Minnie didn't move. She didn't even blink. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them did. Then Mrs. Brantley turned and left, the lantern's light shrinking with each step until only the dark was left. Sarah found Minnie still sitting there hours later, the book open in her lap, her face unreadable. "She'll come again," Sarah whispered. "I know," Minnie said quietly. "But next time I'll be ready." Mrs. Brantley did not sleep that night. She walked the upstairs hall in slow, planned steps, her nightgown whispering against the wood floor. The lantern she carried threw long, trembling shadows over the wallpaper. The same pale blue flowers that had once seemed soft now looked like something choked. Below her, the house was silent. Edward had gone to the study again, the sound of glass clinking, echoing faintly through the floorboards. Minnie lay awake on her cot in the workers' quarters, the poetry book pressed to her chest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the mistress's face, not angry, not wild, but blank, the kind of blank that comes before something worse. By dawn, the air in the house felt wrong. The worker spoke in whispers. Sarah's hand shook as she poured coffee, and even Samuel forgot to hum. Everyone knew the quiet in that house was about to end. Mrs. Brantley entered the sitting room after breakfast, still in her robe, her hair undone. "Fetch her," she told Sarah. "Mom, she's not fetch her." When Minnie was brought in, the mistress stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel as though to steady herself. "You think you've grown clever," she said. "You think because you've learned a few words and found pity in my husband's eyes that you can speak." Minnie's voice trembled, but not with fear. "I don't need pity." "No," the mistress said, smiling faintly. "You need correction." She crossed the room slowly and opened the drawer of a small cabinet near the piano. Inside was a silver brush, heavy, engraved, beautiful. "My mother used to say that the only way to teach grace is through pain." Minnie's heart pounded, but she didn't step back. "Your mother was wrong." The mistress froze. It wasn't the words themselves. It was that Minnie had spoken them calmly, clearly, without flinching. Something cracked then, though no one saw it. The mistress's control, long and polished as stone, began to splinter. She dropped the brush, dropped. It hit the floor with a sharp clang that seemed to echo through the house. Edward appeared in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes red. "Ellen," he said quietly. She turned to him, voice shaking. "You've ruined her. You've let her forget what she is." He took a slow step forward. "She's what you made her." For a moment neither spoke. The fire popped between them, sending up a brief spark that vanished in the air. Then Mrs. Brantley did something no one expected. She laughed softly at first, then louder, her voice breaking into something that didn't sound like laughter at all. When it faded, she looked back at Minnie. "Then you can have her," she said. "You can both live in your little world of pity and poetry, but remember, child, everything that grows in this house dies in it too." She walked out, her robe trailing like a veil, leaving the smell of roses and ashes behind. Edward stood still for a long moment. Then quietly he said, "Pack your things." Minnie looked up. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Just not here." Outside, the wind began to rise, and for the first time in her life, Minnie felt the house shake. Minnie didn't move. The words, "Pack your things," hung in the air like a lie no one wanted to test. Edward stood there, shoulders heavy, the smell of whiskey clinging to him like guilt. His eyes weren't on her. They were on the window, on the rain that had started to fall again. "You can't stay here," he said. "She'll destroy you if you do." Minnie's voice came out small, calm. "She already has." He winced. Maybe because he knew it was true, maybe because it was the same truth that chained him to that house. By the time dawn rose, he had found her a dress, a pair of shoes that didn't fit, and a small sack of food from the kitchen. Sarah helped her tie it closed. Her hands shook the whole time. "You sure you want this, baby?" Sarah asked. "There's nothing good out there," Minnie said, "but there's nothing good in here either." That was the thing Minnie had learned. The moment she realized the house was a cage was the moment it stopped being a home. Sarah leaned close, whispering, "You keep north in your head. Don't stop walking till your shadow gets small behind you." When Edward came down from the study, he looked different, sober but not steady. "She's asleep," he said quietly. "Now's the time." The house was silent as they crossed it. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet, soft and slow, like sighs from the dead. Minnie didn't look back. She didn't want to see the sitting room again, the velvet drapes, the chair by the window where she'd learned to sit still. At the door, Edward paused. "You'll head towards Somerville. There's a woman there who I'll find my own way." Minnie interrupted. He looked down at her, his jaw tight. "You're braver than me." She shook her head. "No, just smaller. You get to hide behind your size." He almost smiled. "Almost. Go before I change my mind." Minnie stepped into the night. The air was cold, damp with rain and the smell of pine. She walked without looking back, the small book tucked into her sack, the only thing she had ever owned. She didn't know the way, only that the air felt lighter away from the house, and the earth felt softer beneath her feet. Minnie walked for days. She slept under trees and ate the dry bread sparingly. The book she couldn't yet read was her compass. She would trace the letters, imagining the sound of the words until they felt like a map of a place she belonged. She learned to listen to the quiet, the rustle of leaves, the quick step of a rabbit, the way the wind sounded when it wasn't filtered through the lace curtains. She learned how to be invisible again, only this time she chose it. She reached a trading post 2 weeks later, a small cluster of houses with a tall church spire that seemed to point straight to a question she didn't have the answer to yet. The store owner, a man named Reeves, smiled too wide when he saw her. "You look lost, little one." He offered her a sweet roll, but his eyes were too sharp. She took the roll but kept her answers short, watching him watch her. She moved on quickly, trusting the feeling in her gut over the comfort of a warm meal. By the time he looked for her again, she was gone, walking a path only the runaway knows. The house Minnie left behind did not recover. Edward stayed for another month. The arguing with his wife did not stop, but it grew quieter, colder, like 2 ice blocks hitting each other. He started selling things, the porcelain, the velvet drapes, the expensive wine. Mrs. Brantley didn't notice. She spent her days in the sitting room, talking to the empty air or to the small chair by the window. "Do you see me now, Minnie? Are you watching?" she'd whisper as if listening for a reply. Then she'd laugh quietly, bitterly. Of course you won't answer. I never let you. One night, Edward found her standing by the fireplace, her reflection flickering in the mirror above it. "Ellen," he said gently, "come to bed." She didn't turn. "Do you think she's alive?" He hesitated. "If she's lucky, then luck is wasted on her," the mistress said. "She wouldn't know what to do with it." He sighed, but she wasn't finished. "Do you know what they'll say, Edward? That I couldn't keep my own worker, that I let her run wild." "Let her go," he said quietly. "She was never yours." Mrs. Brantley turned then slowly, her face pale in the firelight. "You don't understand. I made her what she was. I gave her beauty. I gave her purpose. Without me, she's nothing." Edward's expression hardened. "Then why does it feel like she took the whole house with her?" For a long time the only sound was the fire cracking behind them. When he finally left the room, the mistress remained by the window, staring out into the night where the fields disappeared into darkness. She thought she saw something move, a small shape walking the edge of the trees, but when she blinked, it was gone. Still, she kept watching, because even in her madness, some part of her understood what pride refused to admit, that the girl she had called pet was the only living thing that had ever made the house feel human. The first weeks on the road blurred into a simple kind of peace. Minnie's legs grew stronger, her back no longer hurt from sitting too straight. She found work on a small farm outside a town called Willow Creek, helping a woman named Ruth with the laundry by the river. The work was hard, her hands often raw, and the sun was unkind to her pale skin, but it was work that gave her food she earned, not food she was fed. The town was smaller than she imagined, just a scatter of wooden houses, a church, and a trading post that smelled of tobacco and soap. People stared when she walked through, not cruelly, just curious. She was small, and her steps carried that mix of delicacy and purpose that made strangers uneasy. A woman standing by the well called to her, "You look lost, child. You got people here?" Minnie hesitated. "No, ma'am." The woman studied her, the mud on her skin, the steady way. She didn't flinch. "Name's Ruth. I keep the laundry down by the river. You hungry?" Minnie nodded. Ruth fed her cornbread and stew that tasted like home. Then she said, "You can stay a while if you help. Got more clothes than I can scrub before Sunday." For the first time since she'd left Charleston, Minnie smiled, small, cautious, but real. Days flowed into a rhythm of work and sleep. Minnie learned to read from an old Bible Ruth kept by the bed. The poetry book she carried was finally making sense. One evening, an older man named Alma, who worked the forge, told her, "Don't mistake resting for stopping, child. The good Lord's got patience, but men don't. You rest too long, and they'll make your road theirs again." Minnie nodded, clutching her pouch. "I won't stop." "Good," Alma said. "Then maybe he'll let you keep what little freedom you've stolen." That night, Minnie slipped away before dawn, the church bell silent behind her, the hymn still humming in her chest. In Charleston, the Brantley house had begun to rot from the inside out. The workers whispered that the walls smelled of mildew now, though the mistress scrubbed them every morning with rose water. The mirrors had been covered with cloth. She claimed they made her sick, that she could see her in them. The small one, the girl who had run. Mrs. Brantley no longer took breakfast downstairs. She stayed in her room, curtains drawn tight, the air heavy with perfume and decay. Her meals went untouched. Her tea turned cold. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, had become a thread that snapped easily. Edward avoided her. He had moved his things into the study and spent most nights drinking alone. The house, once so precise, had fallen into a kind of quiet disorder. Dishes went unpolished. Lamps went unlit. Even the piano, the mistress's pride, gathered dust. Sarah did what she could, but she kept her steps soft, her eyes down. She knew that when a house like this began to collapse, it was best to look invisible. One afternoon, Mrs. Brantley came down the stairs without warning. Her hair was undone, her dress half-buttoned. She went straight to the kitchen. Sarah looked up, her heart pounding. "Have you heard from her?" Sarah shook her head. "No, ma'am." The mistress picked up a dirty cloth and wiped the counter. Why did she run? Sarah watched her, unable to speak. "I gave her everything," Mrs. Brantley said. "Beauty, food, a place to sit. A piece of art doesn't run. A mistake does." "It's a cruel kind in here," Sarah said. "But cruelty is just another kind of care. I made her perfect. I gave her grace. Without me, she'd still be crawling in the dirt." Sarah wanted to say something, anything, but words felt dangerous in the room with that kind of madness. That night, Edward found his wife sitting in the dark, staring into the fireplace, though no fire burned. "Ellen," he said gently, "you have to let her go." Mrs. Brantley didn't look at him. "She hasn't gone. I hear her at night in the hall in the walls." He sighed. "That's your guilt talking." "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That's her walking." Edward left her there, but her words followed him like a chill down the spine. He poured himself another drink and tried not to listen for footsteps that weren't there. Upstairs, the mistress was still watching the sitting room. Minnie, on the other hand, was following the river north. She stayed in the water, the cold biting at her skin. The current tugged at her legs, urging her forward. Reeves stopped humming, his head turned, his eyes scanning the trees. Then, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, he said softly, "You can run, little one." But every road ends somewhere. Minnie didn't wait to hear more. She pushed forward, the water rising to her waist, the sound of her breath lost beneath the rush of the current. When the forest swallowed her again, Reeves stood on the bank, watching the ripples fade. He knelt, dipped his fingers in the water, and tasted the mud. "She's close," he whispered. Close enough to start praying. The creek curved north, winding through the trees like a thin thread of silver. Minnie followed it until her legs nearly gave out, each step a fight against mud and exhaustion. Her clothes were soaked, her fingers numb, but the sound of running water comforted her. It was the only thing in the world that didn't sound like pursuit. When the sun began to set, she saw smoke curling above the tree line, faint, steady, not campfire smoke, but chimney smoke. She crept closer, careful with each step, until the shape of a cabin appeared through the mist. It leaned slightly to one side, built of gray wood, and surrounded by a small patch of garden gone wild. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time before knocking. The door opened to a thin woman with rough hands and weary eyes. "You lost?" she asked. "Just tired," Minnie said. "I can work for food." The woman's eyes softened when she took in Minnie's size, her torn dress, her swollen feet. "You're too little for work," she murmured. Then louder, "Come in before the dark catches you." Her name was Martha, and she lived alone, trapping and gardening. She didn't ask Minnie's name or where she was going. She just gave her a corner by the fire and a bowl of thick soup. Minnie ate slowly, feeling the warmth return to her body. "I'm going north," Minnie said, finally breaking the silence. "I need to make my way north." Martha studied her for a moment, then reached for a loaf of bread. "Then you'll eat and rest. Ain't my business what you're leaving, long as you don't bring it to my door." For the first time in days, Minnie slept under a roof. She dreamed of rivers and voices calling her name of firelight that never went out. When she woke, dawn was just breaking. Martha was already outside tending to a line of traps near the creek. "You walk careful," Martha said when Minnie came to her side. "There's men downriver asking about a girl fits your shape. Said she's dangerous." Minnie's heart clenched. He's close. Martha's eyes were steady. Close enough. I heard his horse. The older woman looked at her a moment longer. You just a small thing, but you got teeth. Use 'em, and don't stop walking. Minnie nodded, clutching her little book. Martha gave her dried meat and a heavy cloak. You keep your head low, child. The good Lord's got patience, but men don't. You rest too long, and they'll make your road theirs again. Minnie nodded, clutching her pouch. I won't stop. Good, Alma said. Then maybe he'll let you keep what little freedom you've stolen. That night, Minnie slipped away before dawn, the church bell silent behind her, the hymn still humming in her chest. The rain started again, cold and slow. She walked through it until the cabin and the river were just a memory. She found a wagon train heading toward the mountains. The driver, a kind man named Samuel, looked at her for a long time, then nodded. Hop in, little one. The back is empty. Minnie sat in the straw, silent beside him as the road wound through open country. When he asked where she came from, she only said south. When he asked her name, she said, doesn't matter. By the time they reached the border to Virginia, the world felt lighter, the air less thick, the eyes less sharp. The man pointed to a cluster of distant lights. There, he said, that's where the free ones go. Minnie stared at it for a long time. Then she whispered, ain't nobody free till they stop looking back. The man didn't understand, but he nodded anyway. Back in Charleston, the Brantley estate was silent. Edward had left. The mistress was found one morning sitting at her sitting-room window, her hair uncombed, her eyes fixed on the garden. She kept a doll on her lap, small, hand-carved with ribbon around its neck. She called it Minnie, and she talked to it until her voice gave out. The house decayed around her, its walls yellowing, its music long gone. And far away, by the edge of a river she didn't know the name of, the real Minnie stood watching the water. The wind carried the smell of pine and salt. She bent down, picked up a flat stone, and let it drop into the current. The ripples spread, quiet and certain, the only sound left of a life she had refused to let anyone own. If this story held you, even for a moment, sign up to the macabre record. There are more truths buried beneath the soil of the old world, waiting to be heard. Tell me where you're listening from in the comments below.